Welcome to Lore of the Lost, where we uncover stories from the past steeped in truth and historical accuracy. Tonight we journey to London in the autumn of 1888, when gas lamps flickered against the encroaching darkness and the cobblestone streets of Whitechapel echoed with fear. We follow Detective Inspector Thomas Hartwell of the Metropolitan Police as he navigates the grim reality of investigating the most notorious unsolved murders in Victorian history. The Metropolitan Police Force, established just 59 years earlier, was still developing its investigative methods. Officers like Hartwell worked within a system that relied on observation, intuition, and the limited scientific knowledge of the era, pursuing justice through determination rather than the forensic tools we know today. Inspector Hartwell begins his morning at 4:30 in his modest lodgings on Dorset Street, washing with cold water from a ceramic basin that he fills from a shared pump in the courtyard below. He dresses methodically in his regulation dark wool uniform, the fabric heavy and scratchy against his skin. The Metropolitan Police helmet, with its distinctive shape and silver badge, had only been standard issue for 15 years, replacing the earlier top hat design that proved impractical for street work. His uniform includes a thick leather belt that holds his wooden truncheon and a brass whistle for summoning assistance. The morning ritual is performed by candlelight, as gaslighting remains a luxury beyond his constable's salary in these cramped quarters above a bakery. He walks through the pre-dawn streets of Whitechapel, his hobnailed boots echoing against the uneven cobblestones that glisten with morning frost and the previous day's accumulated grime. The narrow streets teem with early morning workers making their way to various labours. Dock workers trudge toward the Thames in groups, their faces already marked by years of hard physical work, while flower girls arrange their modest wares in wooden baskets, preparing for another day of street selling. The unfortunate souls who spent the night sleeping rough in doorways and alleyways begin to stir, gathering their meagre possessions before the local constables move them along. The air carries the mingled scents of coal smoke, horse manure, and the Thames at low tide. Hartwell arrives at Commercial Street Police Station, a cramped Victorian building constructed of yellow London brick, its windows grimy from the constant coal smoke that blankets the area. Inside, oil lamps still supplement the newer gas lighting fixtures, creating a dim, yellowish glow throughout the building. The air hangs thick with pipe smoke from the night duty officers and the smell of unwashed bodies from the overnight arrests crowded into the small holding cells. The station's main room contains several wooden desks scarred by years of use, where officers write their reports with steel-nibbed pens. A coal fire burns in the corner fireplace, providing inadequate warmth for the drafty building. The walls are lined with wooden filing cabinets and hand-drawn maps of the local area, marked with pins indicating known trouble spots. The inspector reviews the case files using a magnifying glass with a bone handle, squinting at handwritten notes recorded in the careful copperplate script taught in Victorian schools. Photography at murder scenes was still primitive and rarely used by the Metropolitan Police, who relied instead on detailed sketches drawn by officers with artistic training. These drawings, executed in pencil and ink, captured what the photographer's bulky equipment and long exposure times could not manage in the dim gaslight of crime scenes. The files contain witness statements written on official Metropolitan Police letterhead, each page carefully blotted to prevent ink smears. Evidence descriptions fill page after page of foolscap paper, documenting every observable detail since there were no other means of preserving the scenes for later analysis. He studies the coroner's reports written in formal Victorian medical terminology, noting details about the victim's injuries that were documented using the basic medical instruments available to police surgeons of the era. The reports describe wounds measured with simple rulers, blood loss estimated by visual observation, and time of death determined by the limited knowledge of body temperature changes and rigor mortis. Victorian medical understanding included no knowledge of blood types, DNA, or microscopic evidence. The coroner's handwriting flows across the pages in the educated script of a medical professional, describing findings that relied entirely on what could be observed with the naked eye or basic magnifying equipment. These documents represent the pinnacle of 1888 forensic science, yet seem primitive by modern standards. Hartwell meets with Constable Williams in the station's main room, where they discuss witness statements that were recorded entirely by hand in official ledgers bound in black cloth covers. The police had no typewriters, which were still expensive novelties used primarily by large businesses, and no telephones connected the various police stations across London. Communication between officers relied on handwritten messages delivered by foot patrol or, in urgent cases, by horse-drawn cart. Their conversation takes place over cups of strong tea brewed on the station's coal stove, the ceramic mugs chipped from years of use. Williams produces his notebook, its pages filled with careful observations written in pencil that has smudged from handling. The coordination of their investigation depends entirely on these face-to-face meetings and the accuracy of their handwritten records. The two officers walk to Dorset Street, navigating through narrow Victorian streets that were poorly drained and often flooded during heavy rains. Horse manure mixed with human waste from overflowing privies created a constant, overwhelming stench that hung in the air like a miasma. Proper street lighting existed only on main thoroughfares, leaving the side streets and alleyways in near-complete darkness after sunset. The cobblestones, laid decades earlier, had become uneven and treacherous, with gaps where stones had worked loose, creating puddles of stagnant water. Gutters ran down the centre of smaller streets, carrying a mixture of rainwater and waste toward the Thames. The officers step carefully, avoiding the worst of the filth while maintaining their professional bearing despite the challenging conditions. They interview Mary Kelly, a local resident, in her single-room lodging that represents typical working-class accommodation in Whitechapel. The room, measuring perhaps 10 feet by 12, serves as bedroom, kitchen and living space for an entire family. A single window, its glass cracked and patched with brown paper, provides the only natural light. The furniture consists of little more than an iron bedstead, a wooden chair with a broken back, and a small table that serves multiple purposes. Water must be carried from communal pumps located in shared courtyards, and toilet facilities consist of shared privies in the backyard that serve dozens of residents. The walls, once whitewashed, are now stained with dampness and soot. Mary speaks in the local dialect, her words shaped by a lifetime in London's East End. Hartwell observes the daily routine of Whitechapel's residents as he conducts his investigation, noting how survival requires constant effort and cooperation. Women carry water from communal pumps in heavy wooden buckets, making multiple trips to meet their families' daily needs. Children play with simple wooden toys carved from scraps or hoops made from discarded barrel rings, their games taking place in the streets since few have access to private yards or parks. Men gather outside public houses that serve as community centres, places where news is shared, employment opportunities discussed, and social connections maintained in the absence of other meeting places. The rhythm of life revolves around manual labour, with most residents earning their daily bread through casual work that provides no security or benefits. Every activity is shaped by the harsh economic realities of Victorian poverty. The inspector visits a local workhouse to interview potential witnesses, experiencing firsthand the Victorian solution to poverty that was deliberately designed to be harsh and uninviting. The workhouse, a forbidding brick building surrounded by high walls, housed the destitute who had nowhere else to turn. Inside, men and women were separated, families broken apart, and residents required to perform tedious manual labor in exchange for basic food and shelter. The work included breaking stones, picking oakum from old rope, or crushing bones for fertilizer. Meals consisted of thin gruel, bread, and occasional scraps of meat, calculated to provide just enough nutrition to sustain life and work. The philosophy behind these institutions held that poverty was a moral failing, and that harsh conditions would motivate residents to find employment and leave as quickly as possible. He examines the crime scene preservation methods of 1888, which consisted primarily of chalk outlines, drawn around bodies and basic measurements taken with wooden rulers marked in feet and inches. Forensic science was limited to visual observation and the collection of obvious physical evidence like clothing or personal belongings. Officers sketched crime scenes by hand, noting the position of bodies, bloodstains, and any disturbed objects in the immediate area. Photography required heavy equipment, long exposure times, and specialized knowledge that few police officers possessed. Evidence was stored in brown paper envelopes or cloth bags, with handwritten labels describing the contents and location where items were found. The preservation of crime scenes relied entirely on the thoroughness and artistic skill of the investigating officers, with no standardized procedures or scientific protocols to guide their work. Hartwell reviews the communication methods available to Victorian police, which relied heavily on handwritten messages delivered by officers walking their beats or riding in horse-drawn vehicles. No radio communication existed to coordinate between stations, and the telephone network was still in its infancy, with instruments available only in the most important government buildings and wealthy private homes. Messages between police stations were written on official forms and carried by foot messengers, creating delays of hours or even days for non-urgent communications. The coordination of investigations depended entirely on written reports, filed in triplicate and face-to-face meetings between officers and supervisors. Important information spread through the ranks at the pace of human movement, limiting the ability to respond quickly to developing situations or coordinate simultaneous actions across different areas of the city. The inspector interviews local shopkeepers, learning about the economic realities that shaped daily life in Whitechapel. Most residents lived day to day on wages from casual labor, with no guarantee of work from one day to the next. Credit was essential for survival, with shopkeepers maintaining careful records of debts in handwritten ledgers, knowing that their customers' ability to pay depended on finding work. The threat of the workhouse loomed over every family, a constant reminder of what awaited those who could not meet their basic expenses. Shopkeepers sold goods in small quantities to accommodate limited budgets: tea by the ounce, sugar by the quarter pound, and coal by the scuttleful. Many transactions were conducted on trust, with payment expected when wages were received, creating a complex web of mutual dependence throughout the community. He observes the medical practices of the era while consulting with the police surgeon, Dr. Phillips, noting the significant limitations of Victorian medicine. Doctors had no understanding of blood types, making blood evidence less useful for identification purposes. Fingerprinting had not yet been adopted by British police forces, despite recent developments in the field. Autopsies were performed with basic instruments under poor lighting conditions, often in makeshift morgues that lacked proper ventilation or temperature control. Medical knowledge included no understanding of DNA, microscopic evidence, or modern toxicology. Doctors relied on their training in anatomy and their powers of observation to determine cause of death and interpret wounds. The police surgeon's report would be written in longhand, describing injuries and findings that could only be documented through careful written description and basic measurements. Hartwell walks his beat through the Ten Bells public house area, witnessing the social dynamics of Victorian drinking establishments where alcohol consumption served as both escape and social activity. Gin was indeed cheaper than food, with a glass costing less than a loaf of bread, making intoxication an affordable relief from the harsh realities of poverty. The public houses served as community centers where news was shared, business conducted, and social relationships maintained. These establishments remained open from early morning until late at night, serving workers who sought warmth, companionship, and temporary respite from overcrowded lodgings. The interior of such establishments featured gas lighting, sawdust-covered floors to absorb spills, and long wooden bars where patrons gathered. Drinking crossed all economic classes, though the quality and setting varied dramatically between the gin palaces of the poor and the gentlemen's clubs of the wealthy. The inspector documents his findings using a steel-nibbed pen that requires frequent dipping in an inkwell, writing his reports by candlelight in his modest lodgings. Electric lighting was available only in the most affluent areas of London, with most working-class neighbourhoods relying on candles, oil lamps, or gas fixtures for illumination after dark. His handwriting must be clear and legible, as these reports will be read by supervisors and potentially referenced in court proceedings. The paper, made from cotton and linen rags, absorbs the ink slowly, requiring careful blotting to prevent smears. Each report follows a standardized format developed by the Metropolitan Police, emphasizing factual observations over speculation or interpretation. The writing process is slow and deliberate, with no opportunity for easy corrections or revisions once the ink has dried on the page. He attends a briefing with Chief Inspector Moore in a police station meeting room, heated only by a coal fireplace that provides uneven warmth throughout the space. Maps of Whitechapel hang on the walls, hand-drawn by officers with surveying experience and updated as new streets are built or existing ones modified. Case coordination relies entirely on the memory and handwritten notes of the participating officers, with no recording devices or standardized briefing materials. The meeting takes place around a wooden table scarred by years of use, with officers sitting on mismatched chairs brought from other parts of the building. Information is shared verbally, with each officer contributing observations from his beat and updating others on developments in his area of responsibility. The Chief Inspector maintains overall coordination through his personal knowledge of each case and his ability to synthesize information from multiple sources. Hartwell investigates the local lodging houses, experiencing the reality of Victorian temporary accommodation where beds were rented by the night to those who could afford the fourpence charge. These establishments provided basic shelter in large dormitory rooms where privacy was non-existent and personal belongings had to be guarded constantly. The beds consisted of simple iron frames with thin straw mattresses that were rarely cleaned, creating ideal conditions for the transmission of diseases like typhus and tuberculosis. Lodgers included casual laborers, sailors between ships, and others who lacked the resources for more permanent accommodation. The buildings were poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and maintained to minimal standards since the clientele had few alternatives. Proprietors collected payment in advance, knowing that their customers' circumstances could change overnight, leaving them unable to pay for continued accommodation. The inspector observes the street lighting system of 1888 London, which consisted of gas lamps that provided minimal illumination compared to modern standards. Each lamp was lit manually each evening by lamplighters who carried ladders and lighting equipment through their assigned routes. The lamps created pools of dim, yellowish light separated by stretches of complete darkness, making navigation treacherous after sunset. The gas flames flickered in the wind and were often extinguished by rain or strong gusts, leaving entire sections of streets in darkness until the next evening's lighting round. This inadequate illumination contributed to the fear that gripped Whitechapel, as the numerous dark alleyways and unlit corners provided perfect concealment for criminal activity. The contrast between the lit areas and the surrounding darkness created an eerie atmosphere that heightened the sense of danger in the neighborhood. He interviews witnesses using Victorian interrogation methods that relied entirely on verbal questioning and the officer's ability to record responses accurately in handwritten notes. No recording devices existed to preserve exact statements, making the officer's penmanship and memory crucial to maintaining accurate records. Interrogation techniques were based on straightforward questioning rather than psychological methods, with officers relying on their experience and intuition to detect deception. The interview process was complicated by class differences, regional dialects, and varying levels of literacy among witnesses. Many residents of Whitechapel spoke in local slang or accents that could be difficult for officers from other areas to understand. Witness reliability was affected by factors that Victorian police did not fully understand, including the psychological impact of trauma and the tendency of memory to change over time. Hartwell examines physical evidence using the limited tools available to Victorian police investigators. His equipment includes basic magnifying glasses with simple lenses, wooden rulers for measuring distances, and his own powers of visual observation. No chemical testing was available to analyze bloodstains, fabric fibers, or other trace evidence that might provide clues about the perpetrator. Microscopic analysis was limited to simple optical instruments that could reveal basic details but lacked the resolution needed for detailed forensic work. Evidence preservation consisted of careful packaging in paper envelopes or cloth bags, with no understanding of contamination or the need for sterile collection methods. The investigation relied entirely on what could be seen, measured, and logically deduced from the physical evidence at the crime scene, making thoroughness and attention to detail crucial skills for successful detective work. The inspector experiences the transportation limitations of his era, walking his entire beat on foot, regardless of weather conditions or the distances involved. Horse-drawn vehicles were available for special circumstances, but the expense and logistical requirements meant they were rarely used for routine police work. Officers were expected to cover several miles each day, maintaining visibility in their assigned areas and responding to incidents as they occurred. The lack of rapid transportation meant that response times to crime scenes were measured in the time it took an officer to walk or run to the location. This physical demand required officers to be in excellent condition and thoroughly familiar with the geography of their beats. The pace of police work was necessarily slower, with investigations proceeding at the speed of human movement rather than mechanical transport. He observes the social hierarchy of Victorian London through his investigations, noting how class distinctions profoundly affected every aspect of police work. Witness cooperation varied dramatically depending on social status, with working-class residents often suspicious of police authority, while middle-class citizens expected deferential treatment. The poverty of Whitechapel meant that police resources were limited compared to more affluent areas, with fewer officers assigned and less support from superior officers. Social prejudices influenced investigation priorities, with crimes against respectable citizens receiving more attention and resources than those affecting the poor. The rigid class system of Victorian society created barriers between police officers, who were typically from working-class backgrounds, and both the wealthy citizens they served and the impoverished communities they patrolled. Hartwell documents the living conditions that contributed to crime in Whitechapel, observing how overcrowded tenements created environments where violence and desperation flourished. Entire families crowded into single rooms with no privacy, adequate sanitation, or sufficient food, creating stress and tension that often erupted into conflict. The lack of steady employment opportunities meant that many residents turned to illegal activities to survive, while the absence of social services left the most vulnerable members of society without support or protection. The cycle of poverty trapped residents in circumstances that offered few legitimate paths to improvement, making crime an attractive alternative for those facing starvation or homelessness. These conditions, combined with the high consumption of alcohol and the transient nature of much of the population, created an environment where serious crimes could occur with disturbing frequency. The inspector reviews the limitations of Victorian record-keeping, which relied entirely on handwritten files stored in wooden cabinets and organized by simple alphabetical or chronological systems. No centralized database of criminals existed, making it difficult to track repeat offenders who moved between different areas of London. Identification relied entirely on physical descriptions recorded in prose form, with no standardized system for recording distinguishing features or measurements. Officers depended on their local knowledge and memory to recognize known criminals, making it easy for offenders to avoid detection by simply moving to a different neighborhood. The filing systems were vulnerable to damage from fire, water, or simple deterioration, and retrieving information required manually searching through stacks of handwritten documents. This inefficient system meant that valuable information was often lost or overlooked during investigations. He observes the role of newspapers in the investigation, noting how the Victorian press operated without modern fact-checking procedures or ethical standards. Sensationalism drove sales, with newspapers competing to publish the most shocking details and dramatic theories about the crimes. Reporters often embellished facts or published unverified rumors, creating public panic and interfering with police work. However, media coverage also helped by spreading information about suspects and encouraging witnesses to come forward. The relationship between police and press was complicated, with officers sometimes providing information in exchange for favorable coverage, while simultaneously struggling to control the flow of sensitive details. The speed of news transmission, limited by printing and distribution methods, meant that information spread more slowly than today, but the impact on public opinion was equally significant. Hartwell experiences the frustration of Victorian-era evidence analysis, attempting to piece together clues using only visual examination, basic logic, and the limited scientific knowledge available to investigators of his time. Without modern forensic tools, he must rely on careful observation and deductive reasoning to interpret physical evidence and witness statements. The process is painstaking and often inconclusive, with many questions remaining unanswered due to the limitations of available investigative methods. Pattern recognition depends entirely on human memory and the ability to connect seemingly unrelated details across multiple crime scenes. The lack of scientific analysis means that evidence that might be conclusive with modern methods provides only suggestive clues to Victorian investigators. This limitation requires officers to be thorough in their documentation and creative in their approach to solving crimes with the tools at their disposal. The inspector reflects on the social attitudes toward women in Victorian society, particularly noting how the status of the Ripper's victims as prostitutes affected both public sympathy and police resource allocation. Victorian moral standards created a hierarchy of victims, with respectable women receiving more attention and concern than those who violated social norms. The complex attitudes towards sexuality and morality meant that some viewed the murders as divine punishment, rather than crimes requiring justice. These prejudices affected witness cooperation, with some residents reluctant to provide information about women they considered immoral. The social stigma associated with prostitution also meant that the victims' backgrounds were often poorly documented, making identification and investigation more difficult. Police officers, reflecting the attitudes of their time, sometimes brought their own biases to the investigation, potentially overlooking important evidence or witnesses. He observes the impact of the murders on the Whitechapel community, noting how fear changed daily routines and social interactions throughout the neighborhood. Residents increased their vigilance, with women avoiding solitary travel after dark, and men forming informal patrol groups to escort vulnerable community members. The formation of citizen patrol groups reflected both community solidarity and the recognition that police resources were inadequate to provide complete protection. Local businesses suffered as customers avoided the area, while landlords found it increasingly difficult to rent properties in the most affected streets. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion strained relationships within the community, as neighbors viewed each other with increased wariness and strangers were regarded with deep suspicion. These changes in behavior created additional challenges for police officers trying to maintain normal community relations while investigating the crimes. Hartwell documents the international attention the case received, observing how Victorian communication methods spread news globally despite the slower pace of information transmission. Telegraph lines carried basic details across continents within hours, while newspapers provided more detailed coverage that reached international audiences within days or weeks. The British Empire's global reach meant that news of London crimes was particularly significant in colonial territories, where local newspapers reprinted stories from British publications. Foreign newspapers sent correspondents to London, creating an early example of international media attention on a criminal case. The global interest put additional pressure on police and government officials to solve the crimes quickly, while also spreading theories and speculation that sometimes complicated the investigation. This international dimension demonstrated how certain crimes could capture public imagination across cultural and national boundaries. The inspector reviews the various theories and suspects developed during the investigation, illustrating how Victorian detective work relied on logical deduction, local knowledge, and systematic elimination of possibilities rather than scientific analysis. Theories ranged from local residents with known violent tendencies to foreign anarchists or members of secret societies. Each suspect was evaluated based on opportunity, motive, and physical evidence, but the lack of conclusive forensic tools meant that suspicion often rested on circumstantial evidence and behavioral observations. The investigation process involved methodical questioning of witnesses, surveillance of suspects, and careful documentation of alibis and movements. Officers used their understanding of criminal behavior patterns and local social dynamics to develop profiles of likely perpetrators. This approach, while systematic within its limitations, could not provide the definitive evidence that modern forensic science makes possible. He ends his investigation day by writing his final reports using the formal Victorian police reporting style that emphasized factual observation over interpretation or speculation. The reports follow a standardized format that includes detailed descriptions of locations, persons interviewed, evidence collected, and actions taken, all written in the precise language required by police regulations. Physical documents are filed in wooden cabinets that serve as the era's information storage system, organized by date and case number for future reference. The writing process requires careful attention to penmanship and grammar, as these documents may be reviewed by supervisors, referenced in court proceedings, or consulted by other officers. Each report represents hours of careful work, documenting the day's activities in permanent form that will become part of the official record. The filing system, while primitive by modern standards, provides the foundation for institutional memory and case continuity. As autumn deepens into winter, Inspector Hartwell reflects on the realities of police work in 1888, considering the physical demands of foot patrol through all weather conditions and the mental challenges of investigating serious crimes with limited resources. The work requires exceptional physical fitness, as officers must walk miles each day while remaining alert and ready to respond to incidents. The limitations of available investigative tools mean that success depends heavily on experience, intuition, and thorough attention to detail rather than scientific analysis. Social challenges include maintaining order in London's poorest districts, while building trust with communities that often view police with suspicion. The job demands long hours, exposure to the worst aspects of human behavior, and the frustration of working within a system that often lacks the resources needed to achieve justice. Despite these challenges, officers like Hartwell continue their work with dedication and professionalism. The case remains unsolved, illustrating the constraints faced by Victorian law enforcement in an era when determination often exceeded the tools available to achieve justice. Limited by technology that provided no fingerprinting, DNA analysis, or modern communication methods, investigators relied on observation, logic, and persistence to pursue leads and develop theories. Social prejudices hampered investigations by affecting witness cooperation and resource allocation, while the class-based structure of Victorian society created barriers between police and the communities they served. The system prioritized maintaining public order over achieving individual justice, reflecting the era's emphasis on social stability rather than comprehensive law enforcement. Yet within these constraints, officers like Inspector Hartwell pursued truth with the methods available to them, creating the foundation for modern investigative techniques while working in the gaslit world of Victorian London.